Hello my friends, it's Gabriel with The Last Huntsman Outdoors here, and today is going to be kind of a discussion video. I'm going to be featuring a handful of rifles, be doing a little bit of shooting clips and stuff, but the main purpose of this video I'm going to be discussing is optics. Now, most modern rifles today are utilizing optics, and I'm just going to point out what I prefer and, just some things to consider if you're like doing a rifle for like your go-to rifle, your SHTF rifle, or anything, preparedness, whatever, homesteading, all that good stuff. Now, I'm going to make this real short, simple, and sweet right off the bat here, okay? So if you guys want the like less than a minute version of this video without all the minutia, I'm just going to say the best optic to go with is the one that you prefer, the one that you have the most training with, the one that you know is reliable, the one that you are familiar with. That's the best one. However, there's some other things you can nerd out to, so stay tuned for the video. Alright guys, I'm going to be kind of discussing and showing a few options to consider when, as far as optics or what kind of sights and stuff like that to consider on like your go-to rifles. Now, one I don't have out here, I forgot to bring it, is a red dot sight. Now, I'll just kind of go into like a little bit of a caveat with red dot sights. Okay, I like red dot sights. They're quick, they, can be decently reliable. However, they do 100% rely on a battery. So, and they have, an emitter and electronic and everything like that. So if something goes wrong there, or you just run out of batteries, that is something to consider if rocking out like a red dot sight. So, for like a long-term SHTF type of rifle, it might behoove you to at least have some backup irons on it, or maybe have something else. So we'll just kind of discuss a few different options though. So this is the Mossberg MVP Scout, got a full video on it, check it out. It does have backup iron sights on there. They're pretty crude iron sights in all honesty, but you can connect with it. But what I do have on here is a primary arms 1:6 scope on here. So it's a LPVO. LPVOs are a great option for a lot of guys. What I have here is the CMMG BR4 Descent. I have the primary arms ACSS GLX 2X Prism. Guys, I will say I am a fan of primary arms. My two favorite optic brands, in all honesty, is Primary Arms and Loophole. Those are kind of my two favorites. And I like the primary arms because I like the reticle in there. They are fairly affordable, but they also are pretty robust. I've used them in some classes. I've just have had this one on this Colt for a long time. This is Primary Arms little micro prism 1X. So I kind of mentioned the red dot thing earlier, but this thing basically has all the advantages of a red dot. It's just as quick, and it has an etched reticle. So that is something to consider, is even if this thing runs out of batteries, it still works. And so, and it, it's certainly better than just iron sights. Now I do like, especially on my like go-to fighting rifle, I do like having backup iron sights. And that's just, a backup to a backup to a backup type of thing. Iron sights, are always a thing to really consider, especially on like a go-to rifle. And some classic rifles like this old SKS here, that's all it has. And yeah, you can bubba it up SKS and make it take an optic, but honestly they all kind of suck. And to be totally honest, in my opinion, the best way to run an SKS is just leave it the hell alone and run it the way it's meant to be ran. So there's nothing wrong with just going with basic iron sights. If that's what you're used to, there's nothing wrong with that. However, there is some disadvantages. Obviously, they're not as quick. they're generally not as accurate, especially out at range. And I know every boomer fud's going to get on here and tell me how much they can shoot out 1,000 yards with their non-zeroed rifle that they haven't shot in 35 years. But, you know, it's just a reality. Is iron sights, even though I like having iron sights on my rifles, they, you know, are just kind of have some limitations too. I think it's always a good backup though, especially for, like, you know, if you're thinking more like I am, long-term SHTF, all that good stuff. Another thing to kind of consider is like more of a classic type of scope instead of like LPVO, which I know those are pretty popular, you know, like your 3x9s and stuff like that, especially for longer range and stuff like that. I like those. And I will say too, in lower light, I will say, like if at dusk or dawn and stuff like that, a lot of times these, you know, classic type of rifle scopes, especially a good brand like a Loophole, and you know that has a lot to do with it too, they will gather light better in low light situations than, you know, some of your other optics. So overall, my personal preference, if I was gonna like pick, you know, of the couple, is I personally prefer a prism type of optic, whether it's a magnified prism like this or just a 1x prism. I prefer that. That's what I went with a lot with in the Marines and stuff. I got used to that. I like how they're just quick on target. There's not a whole bunch of extra things that can go wrong with them. You know, when you start thinking about a scope like this or even like that, you know, there's a lot of glass and mechanism and stuff in there, especially with a variable scope. So, you know, you can potentially have issues with it, especially if you start bashing it around and stuff, which in a, you know, rough type of situation, that's more likely than not. And now I will say too, scopes are built a lot better than they used to be. There's that to really consider. But, you know, my personal preference, I kind of like the Prism optics. You know, like I said, I use the ACOG a lot in the Marines as an infantry guy. We always had backup irons too and stuff. So if I had to pick one, I prefer the Prism optics just for the robustness, and they're just simple. You know, there's not much that can go wrong with them, and I feel like most of them points and shoots just as quickly and just as good as a lot of red dots. A second choice, I would honestly say the classic rifle type of scopes, especially in, you know, my type of area. Having those extra zoomies and stuff like that is pretty nice. And honestly, kind of like I mentioned earlier too, in the like kind of low light situations, a Loophole scope with like a bigger objective lens usually gathers more light than like one of these little 24 millimeters that's on a typical LPVO. Now I will say the LPVO has the advantage of, you know, it can perform kind of like one of these, and it can kind of do what some of this does. So there's nothing wrong with that. I like that in a lot of ways. What I would almost like to see is something more like the LCAN, where it has like 1x and a 4x or something like that. That would be really cool. I'm not spending $3,000 on one. It'd be cool if like these guys came out with something like that, because in all honesty, I find more often than not, you know, you got like a 3x and a 9, you know, a 3x9 or a 1-6. I find that you either want the 1x or the 6x, or on this, the, you know, 3x or the 9x. All the in-betweens usually doesn't really get used much, at least by me. I usually keep it on the lowest. If I need to zoom in, I'll zoom in from there. But yeah, I think something like that, where it just has a straight up lever that can switch over to the max power, would be kind of cool. All right guys, this is just kind of a quick discussion type of video. I'm not going to tell you what the best optic is. Like I said right at the beginning, it's just kind of up to you and what your preference is and what you like and what works for you. You know, what works for me out here in the Midwest and, you know, central Missouri ain't necessarily what's gonna work for you if you're, you know, out in the desert of Arizona or wherever you might be. So, you know, just take a lot of things into consideration there too. But, you know, like I said, I kind of tend to lean on prism type of optics for my rifles. It's just what I like. And you know, I've taken them out hunting, I've done courses and stuff like that with a lot of different prism optics, and so it's what I've gotten used to and what I like. So just pick what you think is best. And I'm kind of curious, and you know, you might mention it in the comments what you prefer and why, and stuff. So with all that being said, God bless. Jesus Christ is King. Be prepared both physically and spiritually. And as always, carry on.